This is interesting. Thank you very much, folks, for joining. And just keep channeling these questions in. I know questions and comments. You got a ringside seat. Sorry, I'm Freudian slip there. Keith, you wrote the article in 2017. I read it, and it's got a lot in it. What was it that you were writing it to address at the time, and why?
It was an attempt to tease out the issue of how you refer to regulated parties, and it was a response also to experiences where calling them customers had not turned out well, and a recognition in my mind that it was not a good way to address regulated parties.
What's in a name? Channeling my inner Shakespeare. Why do you say it matters? You clearly define powers in the ordinary way between a regulator and a regulated parties. So why does it matter what we call them?
Because it shapes the way you think and act. I think words are powerful. A label like customer, which has got some very specific meanings that most people kind of understand, doesn't, in my mind, fit in a regulatory context.
Okay.
Which isn't to say that you shouldn't address your relationships with regulated parties in the way that might contain what might be regarded as customer service principles, but they are definitely not customers in my mind. Yeah.
Okay, no, thank you for that, Keith. And I would recommend, if you haven't had a chance to read it, it's an excellent article and it repays reading. Suzanne, to you, you've got thousands of people in your arm of MBIE, some of the biggest regulatory shops in the country. What do you say about the word customer in this context in the issue?
I'm less stressed about the use of the word customer than Keith. But for me, and I agree with you, Keith, that words are really important. They set the tone for behaviours. They set the tone for enforcement. They set the tone for compliance. What I worry about is the objectification of people and them not referred to in human-centred language, because I think that takes us to a point where we forget that fundamentally a regulatory system is about the interaction of human beings. It's about getting people to potentially do behaviours that they're not necessarily keen on doing. And unless we deeply understand human behaviour and understand that humans aren't always rational, if only they were, regulatory systems would be so much easier, then you run the risk of actually undertaking activities that are either unethical, lack integrity, or actually just simply don't achieve the outcomes that you need to achieve. It comes a bit from John's place, which is unless you truly understand the people in the system that you are regulating and the potential of their behaviours, then it's really hard for you to put a system in practice that is actually going to deliver the outcomes that you need to achieve by not just simply using the coercive powers of the state.
It's a dehumanisation, you say, Suzanne. Keith, what do you say to that?
I think we're saying the same thing. I don't think. I think the idea that you might label regulated parties as customers is overly simplistic, and it drives you down a path where you don't do all the things that Suzanne's just talked about. I mean, it's quite clear that you have to think deeply about the relationship you have with the people you regulate, who they are, what they need, how you can influence them, etc., etc. After all, because you're trying to do that actually for the benefit of other people. And the customer word suggests that the person you're engaging with is the person that is the beneficiary of the engagement. So I think that's the challenge for me.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, after reading Shakespeare, I read the 2022 Inland Revenue Annual Report. The word customer occurs 680 times. And customer and other taxpayers is sort of has a pack of other kind of entries. So they've gone a certain way. They're a regulator. They use their teeth. They cuddle as well. I can say that. I worked there 10 years. I want to just move on to Kane. What do you say about this kind of discourse? It's interesting. And I should just say we've detained 4 senior members of the public service. It's worth doing it because it's an important question, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I mean, look, I think there's agreement here. I mean, I think terms matter, labels matter, how you define those terms and labels matter. And I think it's particularly important where you have public sector organisations that do more than just regulate. I mean, I don't know how many people in the audience are from local government, but there are things that councils do that's obviously regulatory in nature, where the fundamental thing that underpins everything that you do is what's in the public interest. not in the interest of any one individual. Things like building consents, resource consents, the regulation of swimming pool fences, public health inspections, and the list goes on. And there's a graft of things that councils do that's obviously not regulatory in nature: parks, pools, rec centres, the provision of community events, and so on. So I think the terms matter, particularly in organisations where you do more than just regulate, because the concept is something like we put the customer first or at the centre of everything that we do can send quite profound, have quite a profound impact on how an organisation orients itself to culture, ways of working, how it prioritises its activities. And I know certainly when I was in private practice, one of the common things that would come up is that, for those types of organisations, when it came to the regulatory activities, they'd lost sight of the core regulatory purpose of what it was there to do. And often that's because other things, where an organisation does other activities other than regulate, start to effectively dominate. And it becomes an ingrained culture and way of working, and that's where there's a real risk.
Suzanne, can I just ask back to you on that? Because I saw a reaction there, and I think it's kind of the suggestion that, and I think this is where we get to, it's almost the inner Gandhi in us. We become the change we want to be, or become the change we happen to be when we're working. What do you say to what you just heard?
I think, how could I best describe it? We use the word customer, and I use the word customer quite regularly at MBIE. We talk about putting people at the centre of what we do, because that gets around the issue that we had when I first joined, where there was a bunch of people who threw up their arms and said, the customer's always right. So you're saying that we need to do everything they want. And my argument through that from years of practice is the customer isn't always right, but they are your customer. They deserve some respect and dignity. And it's about attitudes and the way you work. So I've then come to the conclusion that the best word to use is people, because very few people will argue with me that they're not people. We can argue whether or not they regard them as human, but they are people. And when you use a language that is about people, then that actually does bring a conversation around whether you're taking a facilitative approach, an educational approach, an informative approach, or a compliance and enforcement approach. And rather than trying to, as we all do, not saying that the entire community of the people we regulate are all the same, you can have a nuanced conversation about what do you do and how do you respond to the various people and the various segments within the system. So my group does do other things, not just regulation, but by referring to it as people-centred, then we have less of an issue, I think, in the debate around when it's service delivery, pure service, than when it is regulatory enforcement. Because fundamentally it is about a person in a system, and just even if they are a known, for want of a better phrase, non-compliant offender, it doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't treat them with dignity and respect, but you can still throw the book at them.
Yep. And I think that's where it's coming out, isn't it? It's manners maketh
the man or person.
Manners maketh person. Yeah.
A good regulator.
Manners maketh a good regulator. That's another one, isn't it? We can trademark that one. I think we're sort of trademarking, the Romeo effect is another one, which I think should go into the sequel article, Keith, because I expect there to be one. Vanessa, what do you say about all this, what you've heard so far?
Yeah, I think picking up your IRD example is a really interesting one. And I think that's when you really get to the point that defining what you mean by whatever the thing is you call these people is really, really important. So I think IR have probably done a great job of, throughout their entire organisation, define what they mean by customer. When you don't is when you get all the problems that all of us have had in our various roles, I think. That in our mind, we've got the Just Jeans customer example, when you walk in the door and you get offered whatever it is that you might want to purchase, and it's customer service and the customer is right. As a regulator, that can't be the case. So it does go down to understanding what the people or your regulated parties need in order for us to work out which is the right tool to use in the right time. And sometimes it is creating a really warm and empathetic environment so that you can understand what's going on for them. And other times it's like when Grant was talking earlier, enforcement's the only action because the the public norms and the social value that you are seeing as a regulator just aren't there. And so there's no point in having a nice cup of tea, because that's not going to change anything.
And so it is substantive relationship, it's nuanced. Keith, I think from your article, it's for Togs Undies point, isn't it? The tip-top commercial in 2006, where I think a young man is running around in a pair of skin-tight swimming trunks, and it's appropriate on the beach, but it's not appropriate next to an elderly woman on the bus.
Yeah. So
apparently,
is it?
Don't worry, I'm not going to do anything like that.
I look back on that in the article, and it was a way of describing I think it was the federal food regulator in the US.
Yeah, it was a US approach.
Who thought when they were doing enforcement, people weren't customers. When they were doing, engagement, they were customers.
Yeah. And
the point of putting that example of the Togs Undies things was actually to highlight how ridiculous that is.
Yeah.
But it was probably too subtle in the article, because somebody later did a review of an incident, an NZTA-related thing, and referred to the fact that regulated parties can, in some circumstances, be customers, but in others not customers, like the Federal Food Administration one. And I kind of regret not being clearer that this was an example to show that seemed to me to be a silly way of thinking.
Yeah. So are we really sort of talking about, I guess actually we find agreement here, what we're really talking about is the underlying relationship between a regulator and a regulated party, and trying to use language to describe the different ways which may change according to circumstances. Where I think you're debating it still is that, I think, Suzanne, if I say so, you're saying we'll stick to the fact that they're human and there's something added there. At least agree on, and there's something that flows from that. Keith, you use the Togs Undies position to say it's relative, and everybody agrees with that, but customers is a no-no. What about people? Would you call them people instead of customers in the article if we rewrote it today, or would it matter?
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, they're all people. I think different industries have different words for the people that operate in them. So in civil aviation, for example, we talk a lot about participants, and we talk about operators, and we talk about license holders, and there are duty holders, and all those kinds of things. So that's the language of the industry that we're regulating. The overall point of the article is you need to think deeply about this and address the people you're regulating in a way that works for the people you're regulating and the purpose and the objectives that you're looking for.
And I think what it also deals with is the actual regulatory function. One of the questions here, and thank you for the questions, let's take a look at some of those right now. How does the focus on people reflect the fact that many regulators are corporate bodies, and the research is clear that corporations don't behave in the same way as individual people? And I guess added on to that, what does that mean about the role of the regulator? There's a sort of an extra bit of teeth that perhaps having customer, indeed having people as a kind of defining index might go on, Suzanne.
So I regulate organisations, for want of a better word, through Companies Office and directorships. We all work in organisations. Who do you think makes the decisions? People. It might be a group of people around the table, but it's still people. I get really annoyed when you're sitting in meetings and people will say, the business will decide. And I go, well, who's that? Oh, that's right. It's the person in the other group that you've decided to call the business, because then you won't actually need to engage.
Yeah.
So for me, it's around the important goes back to having real good understanding, like I agree with Keith, about the people in your system and how decisions are made. What are their motivations and what is causing them to go where they are? For some organizations, if it's a private company or it's a public listed company, it's public shareholder value, they'll be concerned about their reputation in the public, their reputation on NZX, what's going to affect their share price. If they're a privately held company, it may be a different motivator, but there'll always be a motivator for the person who sits at the top of the tree, whether that's the CEO or the chairman of the board or whoever, and fundamentally they're a person. It's not some anonymous algorithm called the company who makes the decision. So they're different people at different points, and sometimes they wear different hats, but they're fundamentally human beings who make decisions based on trade-offs that they are valuing in a system. And it's, for me, for any regulatory system, is fundamentally an exchange of value. They either receive a value for what they're allowed to do or they're permitted to undertake or something they do, and the public receives a value in being either safe or secure, or they know that the system is fair. It's when that shifts and we lose sight of what is the driver behind them, and we seek to just treat them as if it's all rational and we don't need to understand the system in depth and the people in the system in depth, then we get into trouble. That's what I worry about.
Yeah, you get failure, you get capture, you devalue, you undervalue, or perhaps even you overvalue, you get failure, potentially capture. Do you think that's right, Keith? In terms of the valuation of regulated parties. So Suzanne's point is effectively customer, whatever you call it, company, they're all constructs. You've actually got to look at people wherever you look. You're regulating people, you're regulating company, there's people in it. That's the correct approach to regulating. If you get that wrong, you get the sort of value of the person or the company's people wrong, and that can lead to all sorts of consequences that are unattractive. So is it people first in that sense that I've just put it? What would you say to that?
Well, I think I'd say you've got to think about what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
People are a big factor in that. And if you don't get it right, then you'll lose some of the value that you're trying to create for the beneficiaries of the regulatory system.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's really complicated, right? And there is no one size fits all, which brings me back to the customer word is not helpful.
No.
In fact, it's unhelpful.
Yeah, and I get that. And in fairness, I'm being, I'm pressing the point because I'm really looking to see an audience keep this coming in, because I'm seeing they're appearing quite a lot on here. And Kate, it's nuanced, isn't it? It's a broad church. I mean, NZTA is a very sophisticated kind of set of plans that looks at different levels of people where they're at. I've seen it. What do you say about that nuancing? And are you that bothered about labelling, or is it critical to you?
Yeah, I mean, look, I do think the labels matter, but equally, I mean, regulatory systems are never simple. I mean, they're simple in terms of the outcomes you're looking to achieve, but there's complexity built into it.
Yeah.
And then there's more complexity because you are dealing with multiple parties of a wide variety of backgrounds, depending on what system you're in. So I do think that the labels definitely matter, and there's without question nuance in there. But this is why I think, I tend to agree with Keith on the customer, but then whatever it is that you use as the label, it's more the how do you define it and how do you be really clear about two things. Firstly, what is it that you expect of the people who you are regulating? And secondly, what is it that they can expect of you as the regulator? When it goes to actually how do you give effect to that, then you get some serious nuance, because a lot of the decisions that you're making, particularly from an enforcement point of view, can often be quite individual or transactional decisions. When you get decisions around actually how do you change rules or standards, often those decisions, which are regulatory in nature, can have a profound impact right across an entire sector. So there's nuance throughout the entire spectrum of regulation.
And I guess organisationally, I mean, Vanessa, your agency is looking to actually regulate fairness in the market. It's got teeth, but it's also got, if I can put it this way, cuddles, as all good regulators do, in terms of helping the customer or regulated party acquaint themselves with their rights and privileges under the law. So how does ComCom reconcile that with also the prosecutorial powers that it may have as well? I mean, how does all this work?
I think it's about understanding the outcome or the impact that you're trying to make with whatever regulatory tool you were using. And I think that's probably where some people have got tied into knots about using the word customer here, because it becomes a shorthand to capture everything, and that's not what we're trying to do. We've got sophisticated tools now, and that means we need to have more sophistication about understanding for us, businesses, every single one of them, and consumers, every single one of them, are all very, very different. So what are the tools that you're trying to achieve with whatever outcome you're trying to get to? And that's the different nuance in the language there I think.
Yeah, and I think it's also Melissa's sort of wider arc point as to what is it we're here for, in terms of if you had a blank sheet of paper or e-paper and you were sort of writing us out, is it the coercive power of the state? And members of the audience, I know some of you very well and you have interesting views on this, and I'd like to see them here. I don't need to repeat your names, but is it the coercive power of the state? Is it an ancillary function or a central function where you're helping people regulate? Are they actually, strictly speaking, when you boil it down at the end of the day, can they live together? Can they live together? Or are they actually antagonistic? And all the time we're trying to manage a form of antagonism. Suzanne, you've got to say thousands of people who report indirectly to you, and they're regulating, they're being coercive sometimes. You say that whatever, manners maketh humans, you treat everyone as humans wherever they are. But ultimately, MBIE's a regulator, isn't it, through you?
Was there a question?
Yeah.
MBIE's a regulator.
Despite what I've said about the different kind of bits and bobs that we all do.
Yes, MBIE is a regulator in a number of markets and in a number of places. And fundamentally, if you look at the number of people across the MBIE population, the vast majority of them are involved in regulatory activities of some way or another, or in other parts of the organisation, they're overseeing the rest of us, what we do in terms of regulatory stewardship group. You can't lose that from our DNA. But the important thing about it is, and I guess it's around making sure as well as a good regulator that you recognise times change, the population changes, the population's view on things change, and therefore you have to sometimes adapt your methods and ways to reflect that too. For example, it's really interesting that, and maybe I just came in too late in the day, but I haven't heard an awful lot of discussion around the front end of the regulatory system around information and education. Lots of compliance and enforcement discussions. So always a lot of talk about the top of the triangle, very little talk about the bottom of the triangle, where the vast majority of people are. They will usually want to do the right thing. Half of them, if they knew what it was, they would try and do it. And the other half, if they knew how to do it, they would do it if they understood the why. There's a very limited number of people who have decided that they objectively will not participate either in the system or comply with the system. But we spent a lot of time talking about them. I worry about the 90% as well, that we're serving them well. And so for me, it's around, if you're going to achieve, which usually is your biggest bang for buck in the system, around information education, then you need to understand how things have changed and how your message is going to hit the mark, and how is it you're going to facilitate those people to do the right thing, and actually to understand not just their rights, but their responsibilities in the system too. And I think that's where we've spent a lot of time looking at our systems and making sure that we have got the balance right in terms of the investment in the system and the various parts of the regulatory system, to ensure that it isn't all just at compliance and enforcement, but actually is making sure that people truly understand what the system is, how it operates, and their role in it, before we come along and smack them on the head and tell them that they did the wrong thing.
And before you send the four horsemen of the apocalypse that we started with this morning with Grant Barnes, they probably have to have special boats given the area he works in. Vanessa, I could see you nodding, not at the horseman point, but what Suzanne said before. Benefit and burden vis-a-vis regulated parties, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that coming out of the MBIE family that I was always reminded about is that as regulators, we've got a monopoly here. There's only one building regulator. There's only one, as far as I'm aware, there's only one Commerce Commission. But each of us have a monopoly in our own regulatory space here. So in that respect, we do have to be really conscious about where we use our regulatory tools and our taxpayer resources. And so, I mean, I think we're under an obligation to really think carefully about that. And, you know, we could, I suspect all of us could clutter up the district court and the high court for the next 25,000 years, actually, if we only took enforcement action. Would that actually change the outcomes for New Zealand Inc? Probably not.
No.
And so I think we're really, really conscious of well, you're saying, I don't know. So you know, where do we put the balance? And I don't think it matters what we call them, but being really conscious about the decisions we're making as regulators.
In terms of where it could end up. Keith, this is the sort of British government's fault, isn't it, originally? Because in your article you were talking about the 1980s, where they were talking about new public management and value for the customer being strained into the kind of the system as though it was customer delivery. That you went on in the article, that was 5 years ago now, so I should probably refresh your memory on it, but it's out of you're saying it's out of date, but it was never in date, really, I think is the point that you say there, because they miss the point. Sparrow comes back and says, quite right, actually, we could be quite at risk if we take this customer view. We could become the change that we're forcing, and it ignores a coercive element. But what you also said was, I think you mentioned earlier, was that the Americans have a view where you've got a kind of almost a customer service division where it's clear. What do you think about, and we see a lot of units called service delivery, which house regulatory units. Is this another article? Am I being naughty too late in the afternoon, or do we not need to worry about that?
He's having a pop here because my group is called Service.
Yeah, well, yeah. At least you're not called the customer service group, or are you?
No, we're not. Deliberately not.
Yeah. You can get into a deep discussion about this. Customer to me is more associated, services associated to customer, etc., etc. And the Sparrow thing is you're actually delivering obligations. And the whole point, I think, is it's actually complicated. Yeah. And we have a bunch of people in our industry at the moment who we have a relationship with. We certify them as a membership organisation. The people that run that membership organisation are also certified as commercial operators, and many of them are delegated to undertake regulatory functions on our behalf, because the system includes responsibilities for people at all levels of the system. Yeah. So no one label fits for that, and labels are they get in the way. I mean, the point is, how do we need to relate to these people? What are we trying to achieve with them? And we in our organisation, and probably every organisation in this room, the fundamental underpinning is our values. Yeah. And the values, if we operate according to our values, we address all of the things that others might imagine would be addressed by calling people customers.
And you can understand the administrative convenience, I'm sure, of wanting to have a shorthand, but I guess the point is the shorthand costs you potentially if you're that side of it. Let's just sort of arc on the point of something else, which is where I think this is moving to. It's really design. If you're designing a setup, you're looking at the relationships, you're looking at what the policies are, the operational policies, the service design. In a sense, isn't that what this is really all about? Yes, when we throw the book at them, we'll decide not, or it's a warning. But actually, it's the ultimate sort of tackle and design of your shop. Isn't that what this really turns on? Vanessa, I can see you nodding.
And I think it's about really understanding what's the policy people in the room, and what's the problem that you're trying to solve in the regulatory design that you're using, and not to be afraid of testing that question throughout your policy and operational design and then implementation process here, because I think that's what your nub of your question is, I think, here. And that's going to continue to change as society changes and business models changes and consumers change and everything else changes. But constantly going back and saying, is the problem that you think is the problem, are you actually doing the work in every single layer of your regulatory responsibility that addresses that problem? That's a hard question to ask and to answer.
But I think it's the question that's probably, in a sense, at the heart of this, isn't it, Kane? That kind of almost double helix. It's a wicked problem. What are we looking at? Problem of evolution and design.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I mean, this is, often your regulators talk about, risk-based approaches to regulation. I think that can be a real, kind of enabler for regulators to work out where along that spectrum are you actually looking to play. Are you in the directing resource into an enforcement angle, or are you actually focusing on how do you educate, engage, and enable the system's outcomes where you're not using the compulsion levers, which are generally the most effective tools that a regulator has to achieve a fair chunk of the outcomes that it's looking to achieve. And I mean, I think about, for example, at NZTA, we are responsible for administering driver licensing. And so there are elements of that where we regulate, but actually one of the key things that we need to focus on is actually how do we get people into the driver licensing system rather than shut them out. And certainly from my experience, having focused on this over the last 12 months is, where I think historically the agency might have taken a one-size-fits-all approach, which might actually look good from a national point of view, if you look at what's the national averages. The problem is when you actually drop it into what does this mean for Te Tai Tokerau or Tai Rāwhiti and the communities there who equally need access to driver licensing and all the opportunities that that creates, as well as reducing the risk of death and serious injuries because they're actually in the system. You do really appreciate that actually the way to achieve that outcome in those communities is a very complex and nuanced problem, and generally they're not the compulsion levers to achieve the outcome. It's the how do you work with those communities?
And so pivoting on that complex answer in a sense is the overall question that perhaps the customer is really the unknowing public in some ways, the regulated parties, and possibly, and I think we're about to be joined by one, the Minister, we will be in a moment. So I'm going to just leave the last word, Keith, to you, because I think as a good sport. So I'm going to cast my mind back to a British Prime Minister who performed a U-turn, whose surname, she's female, surname is T, Mrs. Thatcher. Mrs. Thatcher. And she said, U-turn if you want to, the ladies not for turning. Keith, you're a gentleman. Are you for turning on your article? Are regulated parties customers, given what you've heard today?
I think the point is actually it triggers discussion and it leads you to considering what sort of relationship you need. And it's a bit of a device for that. So I think as long as you're thinking deeply about what you're trying to achieve and how you're going to do it, that's the important thing. I still would say, though, if you introduce the customer thought into it, then it might send you on the wrong track.
All right, thank you, Keith. As Shakespeare said, all's well that ends well. Suzanne, Keith, Kane and Vanessa, thank you very much indeed.